Welcome. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning on behalf of our presenting organizations, the Boise chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, and the Boise Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, affectionately known as BOOF. My name is Sharon Rockwood, and this is Dennis Rockwood, and we're the co-leaders of the Climate Action Team at BOOF. We'd like to thank the others on our planning team this morning for this planning for this event this morning. Katie Diedrichson, who is with Citizens Climate Lobby, and Rick Groff and Gail Hawkins.
Sharon, people are asking about being able to hear.
Okay.
Everybody hear okay? Okay, sorry. Okay.
All right, thank you. Rick Groff and Gail Hawkins from BOOF. I have a couple of housekeeping items, reminders. In our opening slides, we asked for you to rename yourself and add your affiliation if you have any. And then that helps a little bit. And also, we want to let everyone know that you'll be muted during the presentation. You're invited to put your questions into the chat box. We will do our best to summarize the questions at the end and present them to Dr. deGraaff for her to address as the time allows. Again, we'd like to say welcome. And if you have any comments, you can put them into the chat as well. And we'll try to monitor that and respond to whoever it is making that inquiry. So I'd like to introduce Gail Hawkins, who will introduce our speaker. Gail?
Thank you so much, Sharon. I am so delighted to introduce Dr. Marianne deGraaff, an ecosystem and soil scientist. Professor deGraaff received her BS, MS, and PhD from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And she also conducted her research for her MS and PhD in Switzerland and at the University of California at Davis. Professor deGraaff's research evaluates how environmental changes impact plant-soil interactions, improving soil quality, reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and advancing restoration efforts in the sagebrush steppe ecosystem where we are today in Boise, Idaho. She is associate professor at Boise State University, where she directs the graduate program in the Department of Biological Sciences, and is also associate dean in residence in the graduate college. So we are just really honored to have you, Professor deGraaff. Marianne, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody in Boise, and good evening for those of you that might be zooming in from Europe. I am going to now get myself situated here in Zoom land. I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation up, and then I'm going to need to make sure that I can actually see my own presentation. So give me a minute as I get situated here. All right, I think I got it. Can you guys hear me? All right, thanks, Gail. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak here. I'm excited to talk to you all today. Today, I'm going to be talking about the linkages between terrestrial ecosystems and climate change, with a particular focus on soils and how soils might help us mitigate climate change. The atmospheric CO2 concentration is increasing, particularly since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that in this graph by the gray line that's trending upwards. And the increase in atmospheric CO2 levels increases global Earth surface temperatures. And that's because atmospheric CO2 is an important greenhouse gas. Now, the change in climate, as well as the change in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, impact the way that ecosystems are structured, or the way they look, the type of organisms that inhabit them, for example. And as ecosystem structure changes, the functioning of ecosystem changes. And so this is kind of similar to, think about two different types of cell phones, that are made by different companies, and they are structured a little bit differently. And as a result, they function differently. And so this is the same with ecosystems. Now, as climate change affects the structure and the functioning of these ecosystems, they alter the services that ecosystems provide to us. And those services we rely on very heavily as a community. And a few examples of those ecosystem services include the provision of food, fiber, fuels, flood regulation, water purification. Ecosystems provide us with construction materials. They're a source of pharmaceuticals, medicine, and genetic resources. And they also provide the foundation for our infrastructure. Now, there is a solution to the negative impacts of climate change on these services that we rely on so heavily. And that solution lies right below our feet. It's the soil. And the soil can partly be a solution to climate change because it is able to absorb significant amounts of atmospheric CO2. Now, this slide and this slogan was taken from a movie that came out recently on Netflix called Kiss the Ground. And in that movie, they talk about different management strategies in agriculture and different soil management strategies that can help promote carbon sequestration in agricultural settings. Today, what I want to do is explain to you why it is that ecosystems, and soils in particular, can store a lot of carbon. I hope to be able to provide you with a basic understanding of the biological processes that lead to this important ecosystem service. I also want to point out that those very processes that lead soil to sequester carbon for us and regulate climate for us as ecosystem services are impacted by climate change and other global changes themselves. And in a way, the climate change, as well as some other global changes that are ongoing, impact soil carbon sequestration somehow limits a little bit the amount that climate mitigation that soils can do. I'm going to break this talk up in three parts. The first part is, why is soil a part of the solution to climate change? It's going to be a soil carbon sequestration lecture type 101. In the second part, I'm going to be talking about how common global changes that are currently happening all around us affect terrestrial ecosystems and the ability of soils to store carbon. And the global changes that I'm going to focus on that have some of the biggest impacts on carbon sequestration are elevated atmospheric CO2 concentrations, climate change itself, land use and land cover change like urbanization, deforestation, biofuel production. I will talk a little bit about the problems we face with species, new species, particularly plant species invading our ecosystems. And finally, I will touch on the impacts of biodiversity losses on soil carbon sequestration. And then I will end with some ideas on how we can manage soils to ensure that they remain a part of the solution to climate change, despite some of these challenges that we are facing. So I'm going to start with the first part. Why is soil a part of the solution to climate change? And to really appreciate the importance of soil as a regulator of climate, it's important to take the perspective of the global carbon cycle. And that's what this picture depicts. What you see here in white letters and numbers, I'm going to try to get my little cursor here. These kind of letters in white and these numbers indicate the reservoirs of carbon all around the globe. So they're the pools of carbon, the components on the earth and in the atmosphere that hold the carbon. And examples of those are the atmosphere. They hold carbon as CO2 and methane, for example. Plants hold carbon in their biomass, and soils hold carbon as dead and live organic matter. And finally, the ocean also plays an important role and is an important pull in the carbon cycle. I'm not going to focus on the ocean today because that's not within my expertise. I really wouldn't be able to tell you anything good about that. I'm going to focus instead on terrestrial ecosystems, and particularly I'm going to be focusing on these arrows and these yellow words and numbers that indicate the amount of carbon that flows from one reservoir of carbon to another one. So for example, you see carbon dioxide from the atmosphere flowing to plants and to the soil and then back into the atmosphere. And that really is the global carbon cycle. And these numbers determine how much carbon a soil can really store. I want to point out really quickly, these red letters and numbers, they indicate the additional carbon that is entering the carbon cycle as a result of human activities. So think about, if you look at this picture, you can see an enormous carbon pool here, and that is the fossil pool. This carbon is not normally a component of these arrows that you see going from pool to pool. It's carbon that's stored for a very, very long period of time and usually remains untouched. However, we extract this carbon for fossil fuel production, and as a result, we take this carbon and move it into the atmosphere and into these arrows, into this faster pool. And that's really the crux behind climate change. That's how we get more CO2 in the atmosphere. All right, a few things to think about that really allows you to put the importance of soil in climate regulation in perspective. The soil contains 2,300 gigatons of carbon, and this is on a global level. Atmosphere and plant biomass contain 800 and 550 gigatons of carbon. And when you think about these numbers, you will see that the soil contains nearly twice as much carbon as in these pools, the atmosphere and plant biomass combined. And this means that the carbon is incredibly important in the global carbon cycle. A little bit of this carbon that sits in the soil that gets released back into the atmosphere, more than what we would expect through natural processes, would increase atmospheric CO2 concentrations and exacerbate climate change. However, if somehow there's more carbon that moves from the atmosphere into the soil, then we can actually reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations and mitigate climate change. What I'm going to do now is talk to you about these arrows. How does CO2 move from the atmosphere into the soil and from the soil back into the atmosphere, and what determines the size of these fluxes? All right, so here it is, your soil carbon storage 101. It's pretty basic, really. The amount of carbon that sits in the soil is driven by the amount of carbon that goes into the soil and the amount of carbon that comes out of it. It's really very similar to your bank account. Your bank account, the amount of money you have is going to depend on how much you earn and how much you spend. And so this is very similar. So let's talk about this soil carbon input component of this equation. Plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. And when they take that up, the carbon gets sequestered in plant biomass, in the leaves and the branches and everything. I want to point out that I'm showing you a tree here. And that's because this tree works particularly well with my animations, but really it could be any kind of plant. Okay, this is not just focused on trees or forests. All right, so your CO2 becomes a part of plant material. And at some point, you know, leaves fall, plants die, this carbon ends up into the soil. Carbon also goes into the soil through plant roots. It's not something we see. We see leaves fall and we see the carbon from the plant actually going into the soil. But this process happens continuously below ground too. Roots are like straws and they're leaky and they release constantly, they release sugars, for example, into the soil. And similar to leaves, they also get old. They turn over and turn into the soil as litter. So this is called soil carbon input. It's litter from roots and shoots and carbon derived from root exudates. And that's that sugary stuff that I talked about. Now, the next question is, what happens to this carbon once it sits in the soil? Well, it feeds the organisms. The soil is filled with many, many organisms. It's a whole habitat in itself. Here you see a picture of a soil profile going to 60 centimeters depth. And in that area, there's about 50 kilometers of mycelium, which is fungal bodies. There are 100 billion bacteria, many, many species, many we know and many that are still very undefined. There's generally a mammal or two, not very many. There are algae, protozoa, nematodes, and many insects. I have a nice picture here of some really neat pictures of the organisms that live in the soil. There are viruses, bacteria, fungi, protists. You can see fungi, the fruiting bodies or the mushrooms, slime molds. You can see nematodes, springtails, mites, earthworms. And now, as earth scientists, we are most interested in the smallest ones of these organisms when we think about the amount of carbon that moves from the soil back to the atmosphere. And the reason is this. When a leaf, for example, falls onto the soil, the bigger organisms, let's start with the earthworms, they will take that leaf and munch it up and bring it into the soil and then excrete parts of that leaf. And it now becomes more accessible to smaller organisms, such as springtails and mites that munch on that carbon more. But ultimately, the bacteria and the fungi decompose the very last of this carbon. And as they decompose it, they release carbon back into the atmosphere. It's a byproduct of the process of decomposition. So imagine there's a unit of carbon that a bacteria is eating on. Well, about 2/3 of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. So you can imagine that's quite a bit. The remainder of that carbon remains in the bacterial bodies, and at some point, those bacteria die, and that carbon then becomes sequestered in the soil. It attaches to other soil particles like sand and clay, for example, and it can be stored in the soil for a very long time. One of the things that we're interested in as earth scientists is understanding when bacteria and fungi are more efficient at maintaining this carbon in their bodies rather than releasing it back into the atmosphere. So let's look at that in this picture again. So carbon's going in, we talked about that. Now you know that there's carbon in the soil and there's bacteria. These of course are particularly large. And they're munching on this carbon. This is called decomposition, and CO2 is then released back into the atmosphere through the process of decomposition and microbial respiration. This arrow of CO2 release back into the atmosphere becomes smaller when microbes are more efficient and hold this carbon more in their bodies rather than releasing it back into the atmosphere. That arrow becomes bigger when microbes become less efficient. All right, moving on. You now know enough about what drives soil carbon to understand that changes in ecosystems can actually impact soil carbon in the soil. Think about this picture here. So this is a grassland somewhere. It's very diverse. There's many different species in there. And you can imagine that each one of those species releases carbon into the soil in their own way. It's going to be a certain quality of carbon, a certain amount of carbon, and there's microbes associated with each one of those species. And all of those microbes, decompose and release carbon back into the atmosphere. Now imagine that something were to happen. It could be climate change, it could be human interference here for crop production, and all of a sudden this biodiversity goes away and you have just one species that is now present in that grassland. You can imagine that that's significantly going to impact how much carbon and the type of carbon that goes into soil, as well as the amount of carbon that's respired by microbes, because most likely the microbes are going to change with the change in plant community composition. So that's just one example of how a change in ecosystem structure can impact this important service of carbon sequestration to us. Another example is fire. Think about, this really is a picture of our ecosystem here in Boise, the semi-arid ecosystem, which is prone to burning. Imagine a sage steppe ecosystem that a fire rages through, and now your shrubs are gone. It's going to impact how much carbon goes into your soil. The shrubs are gone. All of a sudden they're ashes. What happens to those ashes, right? And the other thing that happens is that fire is hot and it's going to kill some of these microbes. So what happens to your soil carbon output? And these are instantaneous changes that we might expect, but the changes are long-term because we all know that as sagebrush disappears after a fire, we get grasses in return. And so those grasses are going to affect this carbon input and output balance quite differently from when there were shrubs. And finally, climate change itself. We all know that plant growth is very much reliant on temperature and precipitation. And so a change in climate is going to impact carbon input by changing plant growth. Similarly, soil microbes, just like any other kind of microbe anywhere, is they're very sensitive to temperature and moisture conditions. Generally, a higher temperature creates more microbial activity, and a little more moisture, although you don't want it soaking wet, creates more microbial activity. All right, so after this little introduction, I want to talk a little bit about these global changes that are currently happening and explain to you how each one of those might impact the ability of soil to store carbon. And we're going to start with the impact of elevated atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And you might wonder, how do we measure the impact of elevated atmospheric CO2 on soil carbon? Well, there's some pretty cool field experiments that have been set up all around the world, and they're called phase experiments, or free air carbon dioxide enrichment experiments. And what you see here in this picture is an example of an experiment like that. You see this ring, and that's the experimental field site. And these little white sticks are pipes that vent CO2 over this ecosystem. And so we are able to artificially increase atmospheric CO2 concentrations in the field and observe the impact of elevated CO2 on ecosystems and soils relative to controls that do not receive this extra CO2. So this is an example of a grassland exposed to these conditions. There are examples of croplands. This is a rice field in Japan. And these experiments have also been conducted in forests. This particular example is a pine forest in North Carolina. And what you can see here are the phase rings, the ones that add CO2 to the ecosystem. Generally, there's 3 of them. And then you see 3 control rings that do not add extra CO2 to the environment. All right, these studies were initiated about 20 years ago, and most of these studies have been going on for at least 10 years, if not longer. So quite a few data were gained from them, and this is what we learned. When there's an increase in atmospheric CO2, a sudden increase, like in these ecosystems, in these experiments, what we see is that initially plants increase carbon uptake and their growth. So there's more carbon that goes into plants. And as scientists, when all this started out, we thought, oh, this is great. Plants are going to grow bigger, and there's going to be more carbon that goes in the soil as a result. And so ecosystems are naturally going to mitigate climate change this way. All right, so let's see what happens. So there's more carbon. There's more carbon going into the soil. But lo and behold, there's going to be more microbes that are going to eat that carbon. And so there's also more carbon dioxide that's leaving the system. So what we found across many of these different experiments is that increased atmospheric CO2 concentrations don't necessarily increase soil carbon. So there's no net effect. The input increases and the output increases. Your net bank account is still the same. All right, the other thing that I want to point out, that this increase in plant production that we observed across these ecosystems was usually not sustained in the long term, and that's because plants also need nitrogen, and nitrogen and other nutrients got exhausted in these experiments as plants continue to grow more. So the impact of atmospheric CO2 concentrations on plant growth, that doesn't go on forever. Then we thought, well, maybe it can go on forever in agricultural systems because we can supply nutrients to those. Well, then what we found was that increased carbon dioxide levels actually restrict plants' abilities to absorb nutrients, which is problematic because when we eat plants, when we eat our veggies, we want protein from those veggies in addition to carbs, and we want other nutrients as well. And so we've been finding that plants actually become less nutritious. All right, so elevated CO2, really not a significant impact on carbon sequestration in soil, and a negative impact on some other ecosystem services like food production. All right, then here I'm going to talk a little bit about changes in temperature and how those might impact soil carbon. I actually have a video because I've been talking to you for a while now, and it might be nice to hear somebody else's voice. So this video is talking about how they measured the effect of a changing climate and atmospheric CO2 concentration changes at the same time on plant biomass production. And they have done that using a satellite. The video is from NASA, and it explains really nicely how these environmental changes impact plant production. So now I need to go to this video, so give me a minute as I'm going through this. I practiced it, so it should work. Okay, it's 3 minutes and 33 seconds. Can you hear it?
Since instrumental measurements began in the 1880s, the past decade is officially the warmest on record. Previous research suggested that in the 1980s and 90s, warmer temperatures and higher levels of precipitation, factors associated with climate change, were generally good for plant growth. But it is possible we've had too much of a good thing. An updated analysis published this week in the journal Science indicates that as temperatures have continued to rise, the benefits to plant growth are now overwhelmed by longer and more frequent droughts. Scientists from the University of Montana investigated global net primary production of land plants using satellite data from the past 3 decades. An instrument on NASA's Terra satellite provides insight as to whether plants are actually benefiting from a changing climate. High-resolution data from the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectral Radiometer, or MODIS, indicate a net decrease in primary production from 2000 through 2009 as compared to the previous 2 decades. Primary production is a measure of plant growth and the first step in the carbon cycle. Carbon enters the atmosphere from a variety of sources, including deforestation, fossil fuel burning, and wildfires. Plants absorb carbon from the atmosphere and use it to grow. As they continue to grow, they pull down more carbon and slow the increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the air. It is important for scientists to monitor changes of primary production, as changes in plant growth affect the balance of carbon between the atmosphere and terrestrial ecosystems. This visualization represents the amount of carbon that was removed from the atmosphere by plants during the warmest decade on record. An increase in primary production, as indicated in green, tells us that plants are removing carbon dioxide faster than they usually do, while a decrease in primary production in red means that carbon dioxide is being removed more slowly. Higher temperatures led to longer growing seasons and increased amounts of water and sunlight in the northern hemisphere, causing a net increase in atmospheric primary production. But it was not enough to offset the decrease in carbon absorption in the southern hemisphere, leading to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Africa, for instance, suffered a severe drought in 2005. Crops suffered major losses, and with less green vegetation to fix the carbon, there was more of it left in the atmosphere. The planet as a whole experienced a net decrease in primary production over the past 10 years, but it was a modest decrease. This research reinforces the idea that climate variability is complex. With increasing demands on our natural resources, a growing population, and expansion of biofuel production, it is critical to monitor the large-scale changes in plant growth and how it affects carbon levels.
Video, it is 10 years old by now. I'm noticing that my internet connection is a little bit unstable. I hope you can still hear me. So this study is 10 years old by now, but similar processes are still happening, of course. So what this video shows is that there's a net loss in plant biomass production with an increase in temperatures particularly. It also indicates how complex these questions are, and that the impacts of changes in climate are not universally the same across the world. Some places will be impacted more negatively than others. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute, actually. All right, so now let's talk about the carbon output component of this question. So how much carbon, how much more carbon or less carbon might be respired when there is a change in temperature, and how do we study that? Well, to study the impact of increased temperatures on microbial activity and respiration, we set up these experiments in the field where we artificially increase soil temperature. So here you can see an experiment where they are artificially using passive warming to increase the temperature in this area and measure the impact on microbial activity. You can do similar things using infrared radiation or using heating cables, for example, and this is in the Harvard forest. So a lot of these warming studies have been conducted, again, around the world, all over the place, and results have been compiled, and some conclusions have been inferred from them. So here actually I have another video that I'm going to show to you, and this video is going to talk about the effect of changes in temperature on the output of carbon or microbial decomposition processes. This video actually is from a research group in the Netherlands. I'm not necessarily trying to promote the Netherlands here, but it is what it is. It's a good video. So let me go to it. Hang on for a minute. The Zoom bar is in my way. Okay, now it's still in my way. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Thomas Crowther, and I'm an ecologist at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. Most of the world's terrestrial carbon is stored in the soil, and this carbon is stored predominantly in the form of organic material, and this carbon is slowly released by the activity of soil organisms, the microbes and plants and animals that interact within the soil. However, there's growing concern among scientists that as the climate warms, it's going to stimulate the activity of these organisms, speeding up the rate of carbon emissions from the soil. And these carbon emissions come in the form of carbon dioxide and methane, which are both greenhouse gases. So if warming stimulates the loss of carbon from the soil into the atmosphere at a greater rate, it could accelerate further warming. And this could in turn drive additional losses of carbon from the soil into the atmosphere, driving additional warming. And this generates a positive feedback that could potentially accelerate the rate of climate change over the rest of this century. So really understanding the magnitude of this effect is essential if we're going to be able to predict climate change into the future. It's also very important if we're going to generate meaningful greenhouse gas emissions targets in order to combat climate change in the future. We've been collecting soil carbon data from warming experiments all over the world, and these have been conducted by over 40 institutions across a range of different continents. And this information allows us to generate a map of the spatial sensitivity of soil carbon in response to warming. It suggests that the greatest losses are likely to occur in the high latitude areas of the Arctic and subarctic regions. And it also suggests that in total, we're going to lose over 55 petagrams of carbon from the soil. That's 55 trillion kilograms of soil carbon being released into the atmosphere by 2050. So from the amount that humans are going to emit, we're going to accelerate that rate by an additional 17%. This additional carbon that is going to be emitted from the soil into the atmosphere could drive considerable additional planetary warming. So these results suggest that cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, at least meeting the targets that were set in COP21 in Paris in 2015, will be essential if we're going to minimize the damaging impact of this carbon cycle feedback on the future of the planet.
All right, so I think he did a great job of explaining this. One thing I want to point out, something that he said as well, but He said a lot, so you might have missed it. There's particularly, you can see that with the red coloring here, there's particularly a lot of carbon that's respired from the Arctic. And there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that there's a lot of carbon in the Arctic, which might be weird if you think about it, because there's not a whole lot of plants there. The thing is that whatever plant grows there, and it goes, the plant matter goes into the soil as soil carbon input, it's very, very cold. So the microbes are hardly active there. And as a result of that, most of the carbon that's put into the ground in the Arctic remains in the soil. Now with warming, we are actually creating more activity in these microbes. And so they start mining these huge carbon sources. And that is what we are particularly concerned about, is that release of that massive amount of carbon from the Arctic as the Arctic warms. All right, then I want to talk about one more thing related to the impact of changes in climate on the amount of carbon in soil. And this is actually an experiment that I've conducted in my laboratory. What you see here is a tiny little clump of soil. And it's actually ancient soil. It's soil that was deposited in the Pleistocene and that has been buried and not been touched for a very long amount of time. What we did was we took this soil and we exposed it to modern surface conditions and evaluated if we could get the microbes that were dormant in that soil to become active and start respiring carbon. So what you see here is it's one tiny little clump of the soil that we incubated in the lab. And this picture is taken with an electron microscope. And over here you see a microbe. It's a bacteria. And I just want to give you the background a little bit of this Pleistocene ancient soil that we collected it from. When you look, this is in Nebraska. And this is my collaborator, Erica Marin Spiota, who is doing a lot of work there, and we collaborate. Now, here you can see this darker band of soil. And this is soil that was that formed during the Pleistocene when it was warmer and wetter. And a lot of plants deposited their carbon into the soil, and it's darker because there is more carbon there. This area overlaying it are deposits that happened when the climate started changing since the Pleistocene. And it's called loess, which is essentially dust that was deposited by wind onto this ancient soil carbon. And because now this carbon is not interacting with plant roots or with the oxygen from the atmosphere or rainwater, the microbes in this carbon, in this Pleistocene soil go dormant. But what's happening now is that because of climate change, we see a lot of erosion. That dust that was once deposited is actually eroded away over time. And so now you see here this carbon in the Pleistocene, ancient carbon that was buried for so long, is resurfacing. And so one of the questions we have is, well, how much carbon is in that soil and what happens to it once it resurfaces? Can the microbes get more active and actually release a bunch of this carbon back into the atmosphere? And so we took this carbon and stuck it into little jars, and we added, we pretended like we were plant roots, and we added sugars and stuff to the soil. And we indeed increased microbial activity and CO2 release from soil. So this is just a different pathway by which climate change can also impact CO2 release into soil, into atmosphere, sorry. All right, I want to touch really quickly on the effects of changes in land use and land cover change on soil carbon. Here you see an example of land use and land cover change maps of Hangzhou City in China. And so So period at which these pictures were taken ranges from 1992 to 2012, and you can see massive changes, right? And the amount of urban land that is sprouting up, reduction in forest and cropland particularly. And if you think about it, at least here for everybody who's on the call who lives in Boise, this is something very similar to what we're seeing around us. There's a lot of agricultural land that's being taken out of production, and there's more and more urbanization sprouting up. The question is, how does that impact soil carbon? And frankly, we don't really know. There's a whole lot of research going on into this question. What happens in our lawns? What happens right in our backyard to the amount of soil carbon, and how does it compare to natural conditions? Another example, of course, of land cover change, and that's really important and that definitely has negative impacts on soil carbon, is deforestation. There's tons of deforestation going on all around the world all the time, and it's for crop production predominantly, and for biofuel production as well. And every time we take forests away, we reduce the amount of carbon, not only in the trees, that's usually what you hear about is the trees, but we reduce the amount of carbon in the soil because we take all the big roots away and all those leaves that, you know, put a lot of carbon into the soil. Then the effects of biodiversity on soil carbon. Well, there is a significant loss of biodiversity all across the world that's currently ongoing. And I'm focusing here particularly on changes in plant species diversity, because they have the most direct impacts on soil carbon. Here you see just one example of that. So here the FAO collected information on forest genetic resources from 86 countries, and this was done in 2013, that covers 76% of the total land area in the world and 85% of global forest coverage. And in all that area, they found that half of the forest species reported by these countries were threatened or subject to genetic erosion. That's a lot. And what we have found in some studies we have done in my lab, but also things that others have found, is that when you reduce biodiversity of plant species, there's often a reduction in soil carbon. We don't quite understand yet what the biological mechanisms are that lead to this loss in soil carbon, but it is definitely something that we're seeing. And so a lot of research is still ongoing in this field. Another one that is up and coming, actually, something that people are more and more thinking about, is what happens if we get biodiversity loss in the soil. So not just of plants, but what about all those organisms in the soil? What if they become more homogeneous? But if there's less biodiversity there? We still don't really know the answer, but there's a lot of research going on. And the European Union actually recently had a report come out where a lot of scientists collaborated to summarize the impacts of biodiversity, soil organism biodiversity loss on ecosystem services. And so hopefully a lot more research will get funded to try and get at this question. Then, invasive species. I want to talk about that a little bit. So, if you think about our ecosystem, then our native ecosystem has sagebrush in it. So here you can see the sagebrush. For everybody who doesn't live here, I'm just pointing it out a little bit more. This is sagebrush. And what happens is when we get a fire, the ecosystem turns most likely to an ecosystem that's composed of an annual invasive grass that's called cheatgrass. The picture that you see here is a fire, the soda fire that happened a few years ago that burned 250,000 acres of sagebrush steppe ecosystem. And so you can see here the sagebrush ecosystem with the cheatgrass ecosystem right next to it. So what happens now to soil carbon? Well, there's less biomass, so there's less carbon uptake of the ecosystem. And generally what we see is that there's less carbon in soil. There's more carbon in the atmosphere as a result, higher temperatures, more droughts and fires, which again leads to less biomass. What we call this is a biophysical feedback that's happening. And in our case, as a result of the invasive species cheatgrass, this feedback is sustained. There are many more other examples of how invasive species impact carbon sequestration in ecosystems. And sometimes, I have to say, there is an increase in soil carbon with an increase in invasive species. But often then other ecosystem services are negatively impacted. So, to pull all this together, I hope you now have a good understanding of how global changes can impact the ability of our soils to sequester carbon. I'm going to the last part in my talk. And that I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can manage soils to ensure that they remain a part of the solution to climate change. There's a recent study that actually came out, well, it came out in 2017, and that talks about a 4 per mil project. And so essentially what this study proposed is that when you look at the amount of carbon that's coming into the atmosphere as a result of annual global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, and you look at the total amount of carbon that soils store, and again, this is coming from that carbon cycle picture that I showed you earlier, and you make a simple division, you will find that 4 per mil, or 0.004, is the amount of carbon stock that's needed to increase, that's needed to offset CO2 emissions. And so they're saying, what can we do to increase soil carbon so that we can offset some of these emissions? So let's talk about that a little bit. In this area, we can try to restore our ecosystems. For example, the sage steppe ecosystems. And there's a lot of research that goes into this. There's a lot of research actually across the 3 big universities, Boise State, University of Idaho, and Idaho State, to figure out what we can do to make sure that we get sagebrush back, so that we get a well-structured and functioning ecosystem that stores carbon. This one's hard to do. We still haven't figured it out. Another thing you can think about is what can you do in your backyard? This is also a huge sort of new part of carbon sequestration research that's going on. What can we do to increase carbon sequestration in our lawns, for example? But the biggest gains that we can make are in agriculture. In agriculture, we can really affect our management styles and processes to increase soil carbon sequestration. And I'm just going to give you some examples of that. I'm going to focus on agriculture here. And before I go into what we can do to increase carbon sequestration, I want you to understand that as soon as we take soil, a native soil, and we put it into agriculture, we generally get a reduction in soil carbon. So here you see the soil carbon sequestration rate. You get a rapid decline in soil carbon. And that is because, imagine you have a natural grassland, right? Or a forest even, where plants constantly put carbon into the soil. And the carbon recycles all the time, you know, from soil to plants and back. And when we grow crops, we take most of the litter and definitely the fruits off of the land to eat. And so that recycling is not happening. And as a result, we get a reduction in soil carbon. In addition, some of the treatments that we do of the soil increases or speeds up microbial activity. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And so we increase the output component too. So what we essentially decrease input and we increase output. So you can see what happens, right? But if we improve our soil management, we can actually really improve soil carbon sequestration. And now during this entire talk, I've talked about the importance of carbon sequestration for climate change mitigation. I want to point out that carbon in the soil is not only important to reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations, it is also a really important component of soil quality. And I will talk about that a little bit later. So, to increase soil carbon in agricultural settings, we need to increase soil carbon input and decrease soil carbon output. So let's talk about that. Well, the key thing we need to do is increase organic matter in ecosystems, in agroecosystem. That means that we need to keep as much litter and roots on the land as possible. And that turns into partially decomposed plant material that enhances the fertility of soils. It improves the nutrient supply and the efficiency by which plants take up nutrients. It reduces leaching of nutrients out of the soil. It increases the activity of microbes because I told you that bacteria and fungi, they're fed by carbon. So if you give them carbon, they're going to work harder. It's going to improve the ability of of a soil to retain water and feed water to plants. And it's going to make the soil be more spongy. Another way of saying that is that you reduce bulk density. It's less compacted. It also helps with resistance to soil erosion, and ultimately you get increased yields. So how do we do this? How do we increase organic matter input in agroecosystems? Well, we need to make sure that our crops grow as good as possible. So we need to fertilize. And the best way to fertilize is using green manures or farmyard manures that have carbon associated with it, so that we don't only add nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium to the soil, we also add carbon to the soil to build that organic matter content. Another thing we can do is make sure we grow cover crops. In this picture, over on the left here, you can see an example of an agricultural field that laid fallow without a cover crop, and one that was planted with radishes in the fall. And the one that was planted with radishes always had roots in there. The plants constantly continue to put carbon into the soil. The microbes continue to function in this soil. And there was also less erosion, as you can see here. So less carbon loss through erosion. Another thing you can do, you can see here, is a cover crop called hairy vetch. And that is a nitrogen fixer or a legume. Over here, you see the roots of hairy vetch that has tiny little bumps on it. And those are nitrogen fixing bacteria. So they are able to actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into the soil. So it's a very natural way of fertilizing your land. And then when you take that hairy vetch out or you plow it under, that nitrogen becomes available for the next crop that you put on it. In some of the research that we have done in my laboratory, we have found that increasing genetic diversity in agroecosystems can really help build carbon. So what you see here is an area in Illinois, which we converted from a non-native system into a native system of grasses for biofuel production. And those grasses contained switchgrass and big bluestem, for example. And in our experiments, we compared how much more carbon we would get in soil as we increased the genetic diversity in our cropping stands. So for example, the cropping stands with the most genetic diversity would have 8 cultivars together of one crop species, rather than it being a monoculture of just one particular cultivar. And what we found was that increased the soil carbon input, because if you looked at it over many years at the production in that ecosystem, whenever a year was particularly difficult for crop production, so for example, it was very dry or overly wet, what we found that in the monocultures, some of the crops just didn't do anything at all. They had very low yields that year. But in the highly diverse stands, there was always one particular genotype that was able to catch up even under those really difficult conditions. So we stabilized yields and carbon input over the years. And finally, one important way we can store carbon in agroecosystems is by reducing tillage. And this is something that is becoming more and more common. So you can either stop tillage altogether, or you can reduce the intensity of it. And the reason that promotes soil carbon sequestration is because it reduces the output of carbon into the atmosphere. Whenever you till a soil, you break open these soil clumps, these aggregates, and you feed oxygen to the bacteria and to the fungi. And as a result, these things go wild and they start eating up the carbon in the soil and respiring the carbon to the atmosphere. So reducing tillage is a really good way of maintaining your carbon in the soil. Now, what can we do to make sure that we can get more carbon in the soil? Well, we can really interact between scientists, farmers, policymakers, and marketeers to implement this 4 per mill initiative. I want to start here with scientists because that's the easiest thing for me to think about. We can work on trying to understand better how we can farm in a way that increases input and reduces output of carbon. And we do that all the time. We can communicate these results to land managers and policymakers, and they can work together to implement policies that help carbon sequestration and soil quality and climate mitigation. And finally, we can work together with marketeers to make sure that these kind of choices end up in product supply chains. And that's really where I want to end this presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'll be ready to take questions now.
Well, Dr. deGraaff, we really want to thank you. And this is amazing what you've covered here. What a class we've had. But we do have some questions that have been placed in the chat, and we'll take more questions in the chat as you put them in the chat. But I'm going to have Sharon read a couple of those questions.
Thank you, Dr. deGraaff. Just a quick statement to folks, participants. If you would rename yourself and add your affiliation, that would be helpful. And then we've collected a couple of comments and questions so far, and then they're coming in pretty fast right now. So Dr. deGraaff, one question has to do with bacteria, fungi, balance in the soil. Does it impact the amount of carbon held in the soil versus re-released into the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a super good question. Yes, it does. We think that when there's more fungi in soil, there's more carbon that's retained in soil. And that's because fungi process carbon slower, and their bodies are also more recalcitrant in soil. And so they sort of keep the carbon in the soil for longer periods of time. but many times when we grow crops, for example, we tend to have more bacteria in soil than fungi. So this is something that we see more in natural ecosystems.
Thank you. Another question has to do with perennial versus annual plants. How do they in themselves impact carbon sequestration, even if both are no plow?
Yeah, so I find that perennial plants, and that's because they continue to live throughout the year a little bit, even when there's not a whole lot of stuff going on in the winter. So in general, perennial plants tend to put a little more carbon in the soil.
So I have a couple of comments that I just wanted to point out. Tom and Jeanette said that they noted the time scale on the ag-driven depletion of carbon and the potential improvements are decades. And another comment, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I just said yes.
Okay. Another comment is from Lisa. I've planted cover crops in my veggie garden for years and saw an amazing increase in plant yields. And then a question, what can you tell farmers, or what can we tell farmers about the changes in their yields and financials by making these changes to their practices?
Well, I think this kind of goes a little bit beyond my pay grade because I am not a farmer. I have worked a lot with farmers, and I have farmers in my family. And so I want to always be careful in how I present my work to farmers, because ultimately they're the ones on the ground that really see what's going on. So I want to have a certain amount of humility related to this, right? So in general, increasing carbon in your soil is going to improve soil quality. And that is universal. It does. I would absolutely tell every farmer that absolutely you need more organic matter in your soil. I understand the risk for farmers of using only organic nutrients. And the reason is that when you use organic fertilizers, you are dependent on climate conditions to make sure that those nutrients are released at the correct time that your plants need the nutrients. So there's a lot of studies that have shown that optimal yields are gained when you combine organic farming with some synthetic fertilizer additions, so that you give plants the nutrients right when they need it, and you're not reliant on climate conditions. So if I were a farmer, I would want to be very careful and hedge my bets. Of course, it completely depends on your farming operation and where you live, what type of soil you have. So there's a lot that goes into this decision.
Here's another question that has to do with farming. Question is, in Nampa, which is an area close to Boise, what would be the immediate steps in the next 10 years, say, with the agriculture, urban, and ecological collaboration to reduce carbon? Do you have an idea about that collaboration between those entities?
Sorry, would you mind repeating that one more time?
Sure. What would be the immediate steps in the next 10 years with the agriculture, urban, and ecological collaboration to reduce carbon?
To reduce carbon in the atmosphere, I suppose. Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, I am going to, well, just this week, I had some conversations with the city to maybe get involved in some restoration work in our foothills, and also to work with their farming operations. And so I'm hoping that we can establish collaborations where we can actually start to better understand what we can do right here to improve carbon sequestration, both in the foothills in natural ecosystems, as well as in agricultural ecosystems. So hold tight as we try to expand on this work.
Here's a question from Don Mansfield of C of I. You mentioned the net carbon loss by reduction in the NPP in higher latitude. The gentleman from Netherlands Ecology Institute noted that both CO2 and methane contribute, but in that ecosystem, isn't methane released even greater than CO2 from CO2?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So, yes. So in some ecosystems, the release of methane is greater than the release. I did not go into that in my talk because that'd be too much. But the way it works is that whenever your ecosystem is wetter and is anoxic, so there's no oxygen or very little oxygen, your release of carbon from your soil is in the form of methane and not CO2. And so when we look at the higher latitudes where things are wetter, we tend to see more methane emissions. And so methane is actually, while it is less, there's less methane in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, it is 4 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. So it is definitely a really important component of soil science and trying to understand these fluxes. And it's something that a lot of people work on. I also want to say that I know a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues work on peatlands in Minnesota, for example, where they try to understand if there's a switch of methane release. So if you think about a peatland, it's very wet. And so most of the carbon is released now as methane. But what happens, when it gets warmer and it gets drier in those peatlands? Now, do you get a switch to CO2? And how does that impact the warming potential of these greenhouse gases?
Thank you. Here's a question about farming in Idaho. Do you know of any farms in southern Idaho that are getting paid to increase their carbon sequestration?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. And here's a couple questions about home gardeners. First of all, is there a way to increase fungi in your compost or in your home garden? And another related topic is, would it be helpful to add soil to your grassy areas to improve the carbon content of the soil? And a third is, how does the home gardener get rid of cover crops if they don't dig them in? So we've got a lot of home gardeners here gonna figure out what we can do in our backyard.
Yeah, and I'm still experimenting in my backyard myself. So, so more fungi. You generally get those when you add more carbon. Fungi are carbon lovers and they tend to grow wherever there's more carbon. That's a little bit harder to decompose. It's interesting, but fungi are so hardy. Their bodies are so, they're made up out of chitin, their cell walls. And so as a result, they're able to actually excrete these enzymes that decompose really difficult to decompose stuff, but that don't decompose themselves. So this is how microbes eat, right? They excrete fungi. So rather than us taking food and ingesting it, and then we have enzymes that eat it up within our gut, microbes excrete the fungi, and then those eat it, and then they absorb it. If you are a microbe with some really intense enzymes and you excrete those, there's a chance that you can eat yourself with your enzymes. So fungi don't do this. They don't get eaten by their own enzymes because they have chitin in their bodies. And so whenever you add more carbon, that's a little bit harder to decompose. You tend to get, so for example, straw or things like that, you tend to get more fungi. They also love sugar. Let's see, what was the other question? I got totally.
It had to do with composting, and then a question just and putting soil into grassy areas.
Oh.
Increase the.
Yeah, you want to be a little bit careful with that if you like your grass, right? That's a little bit hard because if you put too much soil in there, you'll just kill your grass. So, you know, the thing that really reduces carbon sequestration in our yards is just the fact that we mow them and we take
2 more questions.
the carbon away. You know, we put it somewhere else. So, you're limited in how much you can increase input of carbon in your lawn if you like a green lawn, because any kind of thing to increase carbon input in your lawn is going to kill your grass. But there are some fertilizers that you can buy at Zamzo's, for example. I feel like I should get paid for the commercial here, that have carbon associated with them. And if you get some of these fertilizers that also have organic matter in them, it really will promote carbon sequestration. And then I also want to point out that if you, I have a good friend who also experiments with her garden, and she just told me that she works with sheep shearer. It's a terrible word to say for a Dutch person. And so she took some of the wool of the sheep, and she said it was very dirty. It was very dirty wool. The sheep didn't get sheared for a while, so there was poop associated with the wool. But she took the wool and put it in her planter boxes. And she said she has never had a better crop. So that's interesting.
Well, excuse me, I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that you've answered a number of questions, and we're deeply grateful. I'm just going to add one more here. Let's see. Well, maybe I won't. It's difficult. I'm just going to say thank you, and Dennis is going to say thank you.
Yeah, I really do. We appreciate it. The CCL and the climate action team here at our church and stuff. So really appreciate you, and we're looking forward to doing future presentations and with agriculture and farming and soil, because it's such a vital part of our approach to climate change. So thank you for your work and what you're doing. I really appreciate that. So thank you. Thanks again. You've given us a good hour and a half. That's amazing.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate it.
For the audience, we're going to leave the chat up for a few minutes, and a slide that gives information about where to send questions or anything else follow up. And we'll let Dr. deGraaff take a deep breath, and we thank you all for participating. And a question in the chat at the very beginning was, will this be recorded? It has been recorded. And that link to a YouTube video will be available probably in sometime in the middle of next week. And because you registered through Eventbrite, we have your email addresses, I believe, and we can just send that directly to you. Otherwise, you can go to Citizens Climate Lobby Facebook page or to the Unitarian Church's Facebook page, and it'll be linked there.
Yeah. So Citizens Climate Lobby Boise.
Boise, yes, thank you. Anyway, thank you all for your participation. We'll put that email address up so you can send information or questions or suggestions and so forth. And Dr. deGraaff, thank you once again. We certainly appreciate it. Okay. And thanks to all of you who have connected from all over the world. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody out there, be safe.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Sure.
Okay. I think we'll get it.
We'll just click on that and then just click all the way through to the last slide. Go to the last slide. Okay. Full screen. You go to full screen.
All right, I'm gonna hop off here if that's okay. Thank you so much for organizing. I really appreciate you letting me participate in this.
Thank you so much. That was just fantastic.